Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Powell-Liberty Historical Society May 2022 program. I'm Linda Miller, the program coordinator for the Historical Society. As with all the programs during the pandemic, we're pre-recording yet another program here today to be streamed on our regularly scheduled time, May 9th at 7 p.m. And after that, it'll be available for viewing on our website, powellhistory.org. We're planning to return to live person-to-person programs in June. Today we have with us Linda Foster, who's a retired teacher and an avid history buff. She's going to present to us Beyond Peter Rabbit. You may recall that Linda did a couple of other programs for us over the last couple of years, one of which was letters from her family, her uncle, during World War II, which she has compiled in a volume. This is her second volume. Some of you may remember hearing her presentation about that. This is a real gem for their families. I'm sorry that we can't be in person today, so you could all thumb through this book, but this is a treasure. Linda enjoys researching and scrutinizing areas of interest, putting them together into a nice program for groups such as us. For this presentation, Linda will introduce us to Beatrix Potter. Most of you probably remember at least hearing about the Peter Rabbit series years ago in our youth. But did you ever ask yourself who really is Beatrix Potter? What were her other interests? What did she do with her life besides Peter Rabbit? So today, we're in for a treasure to learn about that. And we're going to go beyond Peter Rabbit to the life of Beatrix Potter. Let's welcome Linda Foster.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps if I said the name Helen Helis, you would be a little confused. What does she have to do with Peter Rabbit? Well, hopefully by the end of the presentation, you will know her relationship to Peter Rabbit. So, Beyond Peter Rabbit, the life of Beatrix Potter. Well, she was born Helen Beatrix Potter in London in 1866. And she was educated by governesses, and so she had kind of a lonely life. She didn't have many playmates, and so she ended up using animals as her playmates. Her mother wanted her to attend teas and do social events and that sort of life, and Beatrix did not want to do that. She was not interested in making an advantageous marriage, and this was a source of problems throughout her life. Here she is with her father. Now, she was a descendant of cotton merchants and print work owners, so of tradespeople. But her father became a barrister, and he was a very talented photographer, and he got rich in the stock market. So he did not want her to associate with tradespeople, even though she was a descendant of tradespeople. Many of these pictures were taken by her father. But her parents were artistic. They enjoyed nature, which was to her benefit, and they loved the outdoors, and so many of their vacations were in the outdoors. Her father saw to it that she could have art lessons, and she preferred working in watercolors. And there's a book here, The Art of Beatrix Potter, that shows off some of her artwork, that might be something that you would like to look at in the future. She lived on Bolton Square, and there's a picture of her home in the background. She was close to Kensington Gardens and Hyde Park in London. She had a brother, Bertram, but he was 6 years younger. And so she was an only child for several years. But they became quite close. And he also became an artist, but he moved to Scotland, and he had a secret. He had gotten married and never told his parents. So here's Beatrix with a pet mouse and a pet rabbit. And she and her brother had many pets. Their butler helped them sneak them into the house and upstairs to the nursery area. And Benjamin Bouncer was the inspiration for the book Benjamin Bunny. And another rabbit, Peter Piper, was inspiration for Peter Rabbit. And some of these pets they picked up on their vacations in Scotland and brought them home. And this may sound kind of gruesome, but even after they died, she would study their skeletons to be sure that she could be accurate in her drawings. So there they are, the happy family, and they did enjoy going to art galleries, which Beatrix enjoyed because of her art, and they took their holidays in the Lake District in England. And they rented this castle near Lake Windermere, and this area became a great influence in her life. When she was 14, she started keeping a coded diary, and she would do sketches in it. She would record observations. She would talk about people and places, and it offered an insight into the world in which she lived, but it was not decoded until many years after her death. So she and her brother decided that they would start a Christmas card printing business. So this was her first time of selling any of her work, and they did have a little Christmas card business that I enjoyed. And you can look at the details of her drawings. At age 24, she was able to sell some of her illustrations for £6, and they were used in a book of poetry by Frederick Weatherly. And here again, she based the illustrations on her bunny, Benjamin Bouncer. There is a copy of this in the Victorian and Albert Museum, if you'd care to go see a copy of it. And I read somewhere that another copy of it sold for £30,000 for the original. And they've gone to great lengths to preserve these original copies of these books. There she is again with Bertram. And most of her pictures, she's very solemn. And also in most of her pictures, there is an animal of some kind. So you can see that her love of animals has gone throughout her life. Even though she was raised by governesses and alone a lot, she wasn't sad. She enjoyed reading and drawing and kept herself entertained with that, those occupations. And she became very close to one of her governesses, who was really only 3 years older than she was. So in their holidays in Scotland, she met this Charles Mackintosh, who some people think maybe is the model for Mr. McGregor in the garden of Peter Rabbit. But he was interested in fungi, I'm not sure of the pronunciation. And she spent a lot of time researching and studying and drawing and doing experiments to see how mushrooms reproduced. And she wrote this research paper, and she was hoping to present it to this science society. But they refused to let her in because she was a woman, and they were not to attend scientific things or even bother with scientific things. And she really made some important discoveries about mushrooms. But 70 years later, her drawings were rediscovered, and they were published in this book. And take note of the name of the publisher, Warren, because you'll see that again. As I said, she was close to one of her governesses who left them to get married and had children. And one of the children was Noel, and he was sick. And so Beatrix wrote him a letter to cheer him up. And you can see it says, "My dear Noel, I don't know what to write to you, so I'll tell you a story." And there begins Peter Rabbit. Her parents had brothers and sisters, so she did have cousins. And so she would write letters and things to her cousins and to other children. And she used this format of story letters. And there's even a book that shows a lot of her story letters. So she was told by friends that she ought to put the tale of Peter Rabbit into a book. They thought it was really enjoyable, and they thought that other people would like it. So she tried going to publishers, and they all said, no, no, no. And so Beatrix, like the little red hen, did it herself. And so that was the first edition in 1900. Well, it sold out, and she had more made, and she finally did get a publisher. And then she decided that she would like a Peter Rabbit doll. And so she made her own. And she was very particular about everything that she did. She wanted the expression to be just right. And the whiskers had to be just so, and she ended up pulling them out of her hairbrush just to get them right. So she became a businesswoman, and she patented the Peter Rabbit doll, and it's the oldest licensed character for animals and for children. And then she started the World of Beatrix Potter, and it was the biggest literature-based licensing organizations of its day. And some of you may have seen the Bunnykins pottery or dishes for kids, and all these little dolls. Plus, she even made a board game. So she was quite creative and quite the entrepreneur. So her books were published by Warren, if you remember that name. And she did most of her dealings with Norman, who was the son of the publisher. And eventually, he proposed to her. Now, they never really went on a date. Most of their meetings were business meetings with somebody else present, but they did correspond. And so he proposed to her, but her parents objected because he was in trade. And he was beneath her. And unfortunately, he died of leukemia just a month after they were engaged. But she never forgot him. So here are some of the other books that she wrote. And you can see they were all published by the Warren Company. Now, what about her writing? What was so interesting? Well, the animals, and that's anthropomorphic, she dressed them and they acted like people. And there was often a sophisticated vocabulary. unsentimental themes dealing with danger. And in Peter Rabbit, right at the beginning, Mother Rabbit says, "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there, and he was put into a pie by Mrs. McGregor." So right at the beginning, she just tells it like it is. She was very particular when they published her illustrations. She wanted them to really match her drawings. I mean, she even went to where they were being published to oversee some of the printing. She wanted them to be small books for small hands, and she often used people and places from the Lake District for some of her inspiration. Here's a sketch of onions that she did, and they were used in the book, The Tale of Benjamin Bunny. And you can see over there that Peter has dropped them out of his handkerchief, and he's going along the path there. So she became enthralled with the Lake District. And here again, she used some of the scenes from the Lake District. There's one of her drawings, and it was used in the book Jeremy Fisher. So one of the places that she fell in love with was Hilltop Farm, and she eventually purchased Hilltop Farm, and she didn't live there for quite a while, but she would go there to get away from her mother and father because they still were trying to get her to become the social butterfly that they wanted. And this was her getaway place where she wrote. She worked very hard to restore Hilltop Farm. And if you take a tour of the Lake District, you can visit Hilltop Farm and see a lot of her treasures. And there's a book that has wonderful pictures of things in Hilltop Farm. Well, to buy up this place, she started having dealings with a solicitor by the name of William Heelis. And in 1913, she married him. Once again, her parents did not approve of her choice because he was just a solicitor, not a barrister. And they moved into Hilltop Farm. And after marrying William, she wrote 20 books in 10 years. She was very prolific. And this is a book that was written by William's nephew about Mrs. William Heelis. She spent time working in the gardens of Hilltop Farm. She loved the outdoors. And here again, there's some books about her gardening life, and you can see all of the things that she did for Hilltop Farm. There are some things on display at Hilltop House. And if you remember, Peter had the red hanky where the onions were falling out of it. Well, there is his red hanky. There's the dollhouse that was used in the story from Two Bad Mice. She was very involved in the community in the Lake District. And during World War I, there was a group called the Women's Land Army that, because the men were in the army, the women went out and worked in the fields and helped with the farming. And so Beatrix needed more help on the farm. And so Louis came to work on the farm, and they became very good friends. She also invited the Girl Guides to come and camp on her property. She wanted them to have the chance to have fresh air and enjoy the outdoors. The sad thing that happened was she couldn't understand why she wasn't making quite as much money from her books as she had been. and she found out that Harold, the son of the publisher, had been stealing money from the company, and he ended up going to prison for that. Then Beatrix and William moved into Castle Farm in 1923, and she really enjoyed life as a farmer. She didn't care how she dressed. She went out and walked the fields, and had one picture shows her with a gunny sack around her shoulders. And so she just didn't care. She loved the outdoors and the farming life. She now preferred to be called Mrs. Heelis. And there again, there's a picture of an animal. And there she is with some of her pets. And then she became a breeder of Herdwick sheep and became quite involved with preserving this breed because they were local to the Lake District. And here she is dressed in tweeds made from the wool from her sheep. And I want you to take a close look at her shoes, because if you look and read Peter Rabbit and he loses one of his shoes, it looks a lot like Beatrix's shoes. So she used everything from her life in her books. She was the first woman to be elected president of the Breeders' Association. Unfortunately, she did not live long enough to really serve much of a term on that. She passed away from pneumonia in 1943, and she was cremated, and no one knows where her ashes were spread. And there's one of the last pictures of her. And there's a little timeline of her life, and there are many, many more things that could be added to what she accomplished. And if you go to Hilltop House, you can visit Peter Rabbit's garden, because if you remember in the book, Mr. McGregor took his little blue jacket and put it on the scarecrow. Now, what did we learn from the book of Peter Rabbit? What life lessons do we get from Peter Rabbit? Well, life's not fair. Remember, it started out that his father was put into a pie, so it pays to be observant. Peter was in there busy eating his Mr. McGregor's garden, and all at once Mr. McGregor came around the corner. And Peter ran and got tangled up, and you never know where help will come from. Well, some birds came along and distracted Mr. McGregor, and Peter was able to get away. Trust is important. His mother trusted the three of them that they would behave when she went to the store, but that didn't quite work out. You never know what's around the corner. Well, Mr. McGregor was around the corner. It's good to have an escape plan. And people are more important than things, because Peter lost his shoes and his coat and had to go home and tell his mother that he had lost those. And it is okay to be different. Beatrix Potter left quite a legacy. She was a writer, an illustrator, a businesswoman, a natural scientist, a farmer, and a conservationist. And she died in 1943. William died in 1945. She had bought up all the surrounding farms because she did not want the land to be destroyed, the natural habitat for the animals to be destroyed. And so she spent a lot of her money buying up farms, which she left to the National Trust, 4,000 acres, 16 farms and cottages, and herds of cattle, and her Herdwick sheep. And so hopefully now you know how Helen Heelis came to be.
Very interesting.
So
I never heard the name Heelis.
yeah.
certainly not associated with her, but I don't think I've even ever heard it.
Yes.
I had the whole series, I think my sister and I did, and I vaguely remember little bits and pieces, but the jacket, I remember the scarecrow out of his jacket, and they were just such nice little stories.
Yes.
I'd love to reread them, maybe I will.
Yes, yes. So, and go beyond Peter Rabbit and see all the other things he accomplished.